The morning alarm echoed through the pristine halls of Centauri Prime Academy, its gentle chimes designed to ease students from sleep rather than jolt them awake. Every surface gleamed with polished metal and soft lighting that mimicked natural sunlight. The academy was considered the finest educational institution in this sector of the galaxy, where the children of diplomats, merchants, and nobles learned alongside carefully selected scholarship students from across the known worlds. Sarah Chen walked through these gleaming corridors with the steady pace of someone who had learned not to hurry. Her worn canvas bag hung from one shoulder, containing books that had seen better days and a lunch packed in a simple metal container. Unlike her classmates who glided between classes in hovering transport pods or walked in chattering groups, Sarah moved alone. Her clothing was clean but clearly secondhand, and her shoes showed signs of being resoled more than once. The other students gave her a wide berth. Word had spread quickly when she arrived 6 months ago that she came from Earth, one of the notorious death worlds where everything was designed to kill anything that lived there. The stories about humans had reached even this peaceful corner of the galaxy. They spoke of beings who could run for hours without stopping, who healed from wounds that would kill other species, and who had somehow managed to survive on a planet where the weather itself could be deadly. Sarah had grown tired of explaining that most humans were perfectly normal people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The other species seemed to prefer their dramatic stories about human endurance and aggression. She had learned it was easier to let them maintain their distance than to constantly fight their misconceptions. Her first class of the day was Interspecies Relations, taught by Professor Kellyan, a distinguished Alteran whose blue-tinted skin and 4 arms made him an impressive figure behind the lecture podium. The classroom was arranged in ascending rows, with each seat equipped with its own holographic display and comfort controls adjusted for different species' needs. Sarah took her usual seat in the middle row, far enough back to avoid unwanted attention but close enough to follow the lesson clearly. The other students filtered in gradually, their conversations a mixture of languages and dialects from across the galaxy. There were the Vorthan twins with their scaled skin and overlarge eyes, several Centauri students whose pale features and tall frames marked them as natives of this world, and Jex Morthen, whose red-tinged skin and prominent bone ridges identified him as Kresh. Jex was trouble. Sarah had recognized this from her first day when he had made a show of moving seats to avoid sitting near her. The Kresh were known for their pride and their belief in their own superiority over other species. They had built an empire on the principle that might made right, and many of them still viewed other species as inferior. Jex seemed to have inherited all of his people's arrogance with none of their discipline. Professor Kellyan began the day's lesson on trade negotiations between species with different cultural values. His 4 hands moved gracefully as he manipulated the holographic displays, showing complex charts and historical examples. The topic was dry but important, covering the delicate work of finding common ground between species who might have completely different concepts of honor, ownership, or fair exchange. Sarah took careful notes, her handwriting neat and economical. She had learned early that education was a privilege not to be wasted. Her scholarship to this academy represented opportunities that most humans from Earth would never see. The chance to learn alongside beings from across the galaxy, to understand how different cultures approached problems, and to perhaps find a way to help her own people navigate this larger universe. The lesson progressed smoothly until Professor Kellyan reached the section on conflict resolution. He explained how different species had evolved different approaches to dealing with disagreements, from the Centauri preference for lengthy debate to the Alteran system of mediated discussion. When he mentioned the human tendency to address problems directly rather than through elaborate protocols, several students turned to look at Sarah. "The humans have an interesting approach to conflict," Professor Kellyan said, his tone neutral, but his eyes finding Sarah in the crowd. They tend to value directness and quick resolution over extended negotiation. This can be both an advantage and a disadvantage in interspecies relations. Jex Morthane raised one hand, his bone ridges prominent as he frowned. Professor, is it true that humans will fight over anything? My father says they're little better than animals when it comes to violence. The classroom fell silent. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being singled out, of having to represent her entire species in the minds of beings who had never met another human. She kept her expression neutral, her pen steady as she continued taking notes. Professor Kellyan's forearms gestured diplomatically. Every species has individuals who resort to violence, Jex. Humans are no more violent than many others, though their history does show a remarkable ability to survive in hostile conditions. Perhaps we should focus on how different communication styles can lead to misunderstandings rather than making generalizations about entire species. But Jex was not finished. He turned in his seat to face Sarah directly, his red-tinged features twisted into a sneer. I heard humans eat meat from dead animals, that they actually hunt living creatures and consume their flesh. How primitive can you get? Sarah looked up from her notes for the first time, meeting his gaze steadily. Many species are omnivores, Jex. The creche included, unless I'm mistaken about your ancestors' hunting traditions. The barb hit home. Jex's face darkened, the red tinge deepening to a darker crimson. The creche were indeed descended from hunters, though their modern society preferred to forget this in favor of emphasizing their technological achievements and social hierarchies. That's different, Jex said, his voice rising. We evolved past such barbarism. We don't live on worlds where everything tries to kill us. We don't have to act like savages to survive. Professor Kellyan raised two of his hands for silence. This discussion is becoming unproductive. Let's return to the lesson on mediation techniques and how they can be applied across cultural boundaries. But the damage was done. The tension in the room was palpable, with students shifting in their seats and exchanging glances. Sarah had become the center of attention again, marked out as the dangerous element in their safe, civilized classroom. The rest of the lesson passed without incident, but Sarah could feel eyes on her throughout. When the class ended, she gathered her materials deliberately, waiting for the rush of students to clear before making her way to the exit. She had learned this strategy in her first weeks at the academy. Moving with the crowd often led to accidental collisions or dropped belongings that somehow landed near her feet. Her next class was Advanced Mathematics, held in one of the smaller classrooms on the academy's third level. The subject was one of the few where her human background was actually an advantage. Earth's harsh conditions had produced a culture that valued practical problem-solving and mathematical precision. Navigation through asteroid fields, resource allocation during shortages, and engineering solutions to hostile environments had all contributed to humanity's mathematical sophistication. The classroom was arranged differently from the lecture hall, with tables that seated 4 students each and holographic displays that could be shared between group members. Sarah typically worked alone, completing group assignments by herself while her assigned partners observed from a safe distance. Today's lesson focused on quantum probability calculations, the mathematical foundation underlying faster-than-light travel and communication. Professor Thane, an elderly centauri with silver hair and patient eyes, had a gift for explaining complex concepts in terms that students from different educational backgrounds could understand. Sarah found herself genuinely engaged in the work, her pen moving quickly as she worked through the practice problems. Mathematics had a purity to it that she appreciated. Numbers didn't care about species or origin worlds. They simply existed, waiting to be understood and applied. She was so focused on a particularly challenging equation that she didn't notice Jex Morthane enter the classroom until he took the seat directly behind her. This was unusual. Jex typically attended only the classes that were required for his program, and advanced mathematics was an elective course. Professor Thane began the lesson with a review of the previous day's concepts, his voice calm and measured. The holographic displays showed complex equations floating in three-dimensional space, with variables that could be manipulated by gesture or thought interface. Sarah followed along easily, her understanding of the underlying principles solid from her previous studies. The trouble started 20 minutes into the class when Professor Thane asked for volunteers to solve a problem at the front of the room. Sarah raised her hand along with several other students, but the professor called on her specifically. "Miss Chen, would you show us how to approach this probability matrix?" Sarah nodded and moved to the front of the classroom. The holographic interface responded to her gestures as she began working through the problem, her movements confident and precise. She had solved similar equations many times before, both in homework assignments and in practical applications during her journey to Centauri Prime. The solution came together smoothly under her hands. Variables rearranged themselves into elegant patterns. Probability curves traced paths through three-dimensional space, and the final answer materialized as a clean, simple expression that satisfied all the given conditions. A few students murmured appreciation for the elegant solution. Professor Thane nodded approvingly and asked Sarah to explain her reasoning to the class. She turned to face her classmates, beginning to walk through the logical steps that had led to her answer. That was when Jex made his move. Sarah saw the motion from the corner of her eye, a flash of metal as he drew something from his jacket. The blade was short but wicked-looking, clearly designed as a weapon rather than a tool. In the peaceful environment of the academy, where violence was almost unthinkable, the sight of an actual weapon sent shockwaves through the classroom. Several students gasped. One of the Vorthon twins made a high-pitched sound of alarm. Professor Thane stepped backward, his forearms spreading wide in a protective gesture. But Sarah simply turned to look at Jex, with the same calm expression she had worn throughout his earlier provocations. The knife blade caught the classroom's artificial sunlight, casting dancing reflections on the walls. Jex held it with the confidence of someone who had trained with weapons, his stance suggesting he knew how to use it effectively. "Let's see how the dangerous human reacts when faced with real danger," Jex said, his voice carrying across the silent classroom. "Show us this legendary human aggression we keep hearing about." Sarah regarded him for a long moment, her dark eyes steady and unblinking. Then, without any change in expression, she turned back to the holographic display and continued explaining her mathematical solution. "As you can see," she said, her voice unchanged, "the key insight is recognizing that the probability matrix can be decomposed into independent components. Each component can be solved separately, then recombined using standard integration techniques." The classroom was frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Jex stood with his knife raised, clearly expecting some dramatic response to his threat. The other students stared between him and Sarah, unable to process what they were witnessing. Professor Thane remained motionless, his diplomatic training warring with his protective instincts. Sarah continued her explanation as if nothing unusual had happened. She manipulated the holographic variables with steady hands, walking through each step of the solution with the same careful patience she had shown all semester. Her voice remained level and clear, neither hurried nor slowed by the tension in the room. "The integration boundaries are determined by the physical constraints of the problem," she continued, highlighting the relevant portions of the equation. "In this case, we're limited by the maximum velocity achievable by conventional drive systems." Jex's hand trembled slightly as he maintained his threatening posture. The weapon that had seemed so menacing moments before now appeared almost absurd in the face of Sarah's complete indifference. He had expected fear, anger, or the legendary human violence that stories claimed would emerge when threatened. Instead, he faced a young woman who seemed more interested in mathematical elegance than in his blade. "The final step," Sarah said, completing her explanation, is to verify that our solution satisfies the original boundary conditions. As we can see here, the probability distribution integrates to unity across all possible outcomes, confirming that our approach is mathematically sound. She turned back to face the class, her gaze passing over Jex without any acknowledgement of his weapon. Are there any questions about the solution method? The silence stretched until Professor Thane found his voice. Miss Chen, that was an excellent demonstration, very clear and methodical. His eyes remained fixed on the knife in Jex's hand, but his tone suggested he was trying to follow Sarah's lead in treating the situation as normal. One of the Centauri students raised a tentative hand. Could you explain how you identified which decomposition method to use? There seemed to be several possible approaches. Sarah nodded and turned back to the display, beginning to elaborate on her problem-solving strategy. As she spoke, Jex slowly lowered his weapon, confusion replacing aggression on his features. Whatever response he had anticipated, this calm academic discussion was clearly not it. The lesson continued with Sarah answering questions and demonstrating alternative solution methods. Other students gradually began to participate, drawn in despite themselves by the mathematical elegance of the problems. Even with a weapon still visible in Jex's hand, the normal rhythms of classroom discussion slowly reasserted themselves. Professor Thane managed to maintain his composure throughout, though his occasional glances toward Jex suggested he was calculating the distance to the emergency alert system. The Centauri were not a physically aggressive species, but they took the safety of their students seriously. As the class period neared its end, Sarah completed her final demonstration and returned to her seat. She packed her materials with the same methodical care she always showed, checking that her notes were complete and her writing instruments properly stored. Jex remained standing, his knife still visible but no longer actively threatening. The confusion on his face had deepened as the minutes passed without any of the dramatic confrontation he had clearly expected. His understanding of human behavior, based on stories and rumors, had not prepared him for this response. When the class dismissal chime sounded, students began filing out with unusual haste. None of them wanted to remain in a room where weapons had been drawn, even if the immediate threat seemed to have dissipated. The Vorthon twins left together, their large eyes still wide with shock. The Centauri students moved in a tight group, their tall forms huddled together for mutual comfort. Sarah was among the last to leave, taking her time to ensure nothing was forgotten. As she approached the door, Professor Thane intercepted her with a gentle touch of one of his 4 hands on her shoulder. "Miss Chen," he said quietly, "are you quite all right? That was a very unusual situation." Sarah looked up at him with the same calm expression she had maintained throughout the incident. "I'm fine, Professor. The mathematics was more interesting than the theatrics." Professor Thane studied her face for a moment, searching for signs of delayed shock or hidden fear. He found neither. "Perhaps we should report this incident to the administration. Weapons are strictly forbidden on academy grounds." "If you think it's necessary," Sarah replied with a slight shrug. "Though I suspect Jex learned more from this lesson than he expected to." As if summoned by his name, Jex appeared in the doorway behind them. He had finally sheathed his knife, but his expression remained confused and somewhat frustrated. "Human," he called out. "Wait!" Sarah turned to face him, her eyebrows raised in mild curiosity. "Yes? Why didn't you react? Everyone knows humans are supposed to be aggressive when threatened. The stories say you fight anything that challenges you." Sarah considered his question seriously, tilting her head slightly as she thought. "The stories are wrong about a lot of things, Jex. We don't fight everything that challenges us. We fight things that need fighting. A mathematical equation needs solving, not fighting. A bully with a knife." She paused, looking him up and down with the same analytical gaze she had applied to the probability matrix. "Well, that usually just needs ignoring." With that, She walked past him and out of the classroom, leaving both Jex and Professor Thane staring after her in amazement. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway with the same steady rhythm she had maintained all morning, unchanged by the morning's drama. The news of the incident spread through the Academy's student network with the speed that gossip always achieved in closed communities. By lunchtime, the story had grown in the telling until some versions claimed Jex had threatened Sarah with a plasma rifle while she calmly continued teaching the entire class. Others suggested she had disarmed him with her bare hands before returning to her equations. Sarah heard fragments of these stories as she moved through the cafeteria line, collecting her simple meal and finding an empty table in a corner where she could eat in peace. The real story was strange enough without embellishment, but she had learned that truth was rarely as interesting to people as the myths they preferred to believe. She was halfway through her lunch when she noticed the change in the cafeteria's atmosphere. Conversations had grown quieter, and more students than usual seemed to be looking in her direction. Not with the fearful curiosity she had grown accustomed to, but with something that might almost have been respect. The realization was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. Sarah had no desire to be seen as some kind of heroic figure, any more than she wanted to be feared as a dangerous Deathworlder. She simply wanted to complete her education and find a way to help her people navigate their place in the larger galactic community. But as she finished her meal and prepared for her afternoon classes, she could feel that something fundamental had shifted in how the other students perceived her. The morning's incident had somehow transformed her from an object of fearful curiosity into something else entirely. What that something else might be, and what it would mean for the remainder of her time at the Academy, remained to be seen. But as Sarah gathered her belongings and headed toward her next classroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet existence at Centauri Prime Academy had just become considerably more complicated. The afternoon brought combat theory class, an irony that was not lost on Sarah as she made her way to the gymnasium complex on the Academy's lower level. The course was designed to teach future diplomats and traders about military tactics and self-defense, operating on the principle that understanding violence was essential to preventing it. Most students approached it as an intellectual exercise, analyzing historical battles and theoretical scenarios from the safety of padded mats and protective gear. Sarah had been dreading this class since her enrollment. The instructor, Commander Vrex, was a retired Kresh military officer whose species' reputation for combat prowess was well earned. She had expected him to share Jex's prejudices about humans, possibly even more intensely given his background. To her surprise, Commander Vrex had treated her with professional neutrality from her first day, neither singling her out for attention nor making allowances for her species' supposed advantages. The gymnasium was a vast space with adjustable gravity fields and environmental controls that could simulate conditions from dozens of different worlds. Today, it was set to standard galactic parameters, with Earth normal gravity and atmosphere that most species could tolerate comfortably. Students were arranged in rows facing a raised platform where Commander Vrex stood in his characteristic military posture, his red-skinned frame radiating controlled strength. "Today we discuss escalation control," Commander Vrex announced, his voice carrying easily across the large space. "How conflicts grow from minor disagreements to full-scale violence, and how trained individuals can prevent this progression." Sarah took her usual position in the back row, hoping to avoid notice. But as Commander Vrex's eyes swept across the assembled students, she realized that news of the morning's incident had reached him as well. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, though his expression remained professionally neutral. "Escalation," Commander Vrex continued, "typically follows predictable patterns: initial provocation, response, counter-response, each stage increasing in intensity until someone crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. The key to maintaining control is recognizing these patterns and choosing when to break the cycle." He gestured to the holographic display behind him, which showed a flowchart of conflict progression. Who can give me an example of successful de-escalation? Several hands went up, including one belonging to a Centauri student named Kyle, who had been present in the morning's mathematics class. Commander Vrex nodded to him. Sir, this morning in Professor Thane's class, there was an incident where one student drew a weapon on another, but the situation was de-escalated without violence. Commander Vrex's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his attention sharpen. Describe the de-escalation technique that was employed. Cal glanced nervously toward Sarah before continuing. The student who was threatened simply ignored the weapon and continued with the lesson. She didn't respond to the provocation at all, just kept explaining mathematical concepts until the other student put the knife away. A murmur ran through the assembled students. Those who hadn't heard the story looked shocked, while those who had heard various versions leaned forward with interest. Commander Vrex raised one hand for silence. Miss Chen, he said, his voice carrying across the gymnasium, please join me on the platform. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she made her way forward. The walk seemed longer than it should have, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. When she reached the platform, Commander Vrex studied her face with the analytical gaze of a professional soldier. Is the description accurate? He asked quietly. Essentially, yes, sir, Sarah replied, though I'm not sure it qualifies as a de-escalation technique. I just didn't see any point in stopping the lesson for theatrical nonsense. Commander Vrex's eyebrows rose slightly at her choice of words, but he nodded. Face the class and explain your reasoning. Sarah turned to look out over her fellow students, many of whom were regarding her with expressions ranging from curiosity to awe. She had never been comfortable with public speaking, but the directness of the question made it easier to respond honestly. Jex wanted a reaction, she said simply. He wanted me to be afraid or angry, or to live up to the stories about violent humans. Giving him what he wanted would have served no useful purpose and would have disrupted the learning environment for everyone else. And you weren't afraid? Commander Vrex asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. Fear is a response to genuine threats. A knife in the hands of someone who doesn't really want to use it isn't particularly threatening. If Jex had actually intended violence, he wouldn't have announced it first. The gymnasium fell silent as students processed this analysis. Commander Vrex walked slowly around Sarah, examining her stance and demeanor with professional interest. You assessed the threat level and determined it was manageable, he said. This is an advanced concept that most combat specialists take years to master. How did you learn to make such evaluations? Growing up on Earth teaches you to recognize real danger from false alarms, Sarah answered. When your environment is genuinely hostile, you learn quickly to distinguish between things that can actually hurt you and things that just look scary. Wasting energy on false alarms can get you killed when real threats appear. Commander Vrex nodded slowly. Class, pay attention to what Miss Chen has just described. She demonstrated threat assessment, situational awareness, and psychological warfare defense, all while maintaining focus on her primary objective. These are hallmarks of advanced tactical thinking. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, but Commander Vrex continued before she could respond. However, he said, his tone becoming more serious, this approach carries significant risks. Miss Chen, what would you have done if your assessment had been wrong? If the threat had been genuine? Then I would have dealt with it appropriately, Sarah replied without hesitation. But making that determination required observing the actual situation rather than reacting to assumptions. Demonstrate, Commander Vrex said suddenly. In one fluid motion, he drew a training blade from his belt and moved towards Sarah with the controlled aggression of a professional warrior. The change in Sarah's demeanor was instantaneous and dramatic. The calm, academic young woman vanished, replaced by someone who moved with the fluid precision of water flowing around an obstacle. She didn't step back or raise her hands defensively. Instead, she shifted her weight slightly and turned so that Commander Vrex's approach carried him past her rather than into her. The movement was so subtle that many students didn't immediately understand what had happened. Commander Vrex found himself striking empty air while Sarah stood 3 feet to his left, perfectly positioned to strike at several vital points if she chose to do so. His training blade encountered no resistance because his target was no longer where his trained instincts said it should be. Commander Vrex recovered quickly, spinning to face her again, but Sarah had already moved. This time she was behind him, close enough to touch, but making no aggressive moves of her own. When he turned again, she was back where she had started, standing calmly with her hands at her sides. "Enough," Commander Vrex said, lowering his weapon. His breathing was slightly elevated from the brief engagement, while Sarah appeared completely unaffected. "Class, observe the difference between Miss Chen's responses to the two situations." Against a theatrical threat, she maintained focus on her primary task. Against a genuine attack, she demonstrated combat awareness and evasion skills. He turned to address Sarah directly. "Your assessment skills are excellent, but your combat training is unusual. Where did you learn to move like that?" "Earth," Sarah said simply. "When everything in your environment is trying to kill you, you learn to avoid being where the dangerous things are." "That was not mere evasion," Commander Vrex insisted. "Those movements showed combat training, military training." Sarah's expression became more guarded. "My father was a soldier before we came to the academy world. He taught me that the best way to win a fight is to not be in one." Commander Vrex studied her face for a long moment, clearly recognizing that there was more to the story than she was willing to share in front of the class. "Very well. Return to your position." As Sarah walked back to her place in the formation, she could feel the weight of increased attention from her classmates. The demonstration had revealed capabilities that went far beyond what most of them had expected from any student, much less the quiet human girl they had been avoiding for months. The rest of the lesson focused on threat recognition and response protocols. But Sarah noticed that many students spent more time watching her than listening to Commander Vrex. When practical exercises began, partners were chosen with unusual care, and several students maneuvered to avoid being paired with her. The exception was Kale, the Centauri student who had described the morning's incident. When Commander Vrex called for partner formations, Kyle approached her directly. "Would you mind working with me?" he asked, his tone polite but determined. "I'd like to understand better what happened this morning." Sarah nodded, appreciating his directness. Kale was tall even for a Centauri, with the pale skin and refined features typical of his species. His movements were careful and precise, suggesting good coordination if not extensive combat training. "What do you want to know?" she asked as they moved to their assigned practice area. "How did you know Jex wasn't really dangerous? I was terrified when I saw that knife, but you acted like it was nothing." Sarah considered how to explain something that had become instinctive through years of experience. "Watch someone's eyes, not their weapon." Jex was watching for my reaction. "Not looking for an opening to attack. Someone who really intends violence focuses on their target, not on the audience." They began working through the basic defensive exercises that Commander Vrex had outlined. Kyle's movements were textbook correct but somewhat mechanical, while Sarah's responses flowed naturally from one position to the next. "You make this look easy," Kyle observed after Sarah redirected his practice attack for the 3rd time in a row. "It is easy," Sarah replied. "The hard part is learning to stay calm when someone is trying to hurt you. The techniques are just tools." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from one of the other practice areas. Jex had been paired with one of the Vorthon twins and was demonstrating the morning's exercises with unnecessary force. His partner was clearly uncomfortable. trying to maintain the controlled pace that training exercises required, while Jex pressed attacks with increasing aggression. Commander Vrex noticed the problem at the same time Sarah did. He moved toward the pair with the purposeful stride of an instructor, ready to correct inappropriate behavior. But before he could arrive, Jex's latest attack sent his partner stumbling backward into another group of students. "Enough!" Commander Vrex barked, his military authority filling the gymnasium. "Morthane, explain this behavior." Jex straightened to attention, but his expression remained defiant. "I was just following the exercises, sir. Perhaps my partner isn't as prepared for realistic training as he should be." The Vorthon student, whose name was Zell, rubbed his shoulder where Jex's practice weapon had struck with unnecessary force. "He's not following the control protocols, Commander. He's treating this like actual combat." Commander Vrex examined both students carefully. The evidence was clear in their respective conditions. Zell showed signs of impact and stress, while Jex appeared energized rather than fatigued by the exercise. "Morthen, you will demonstrate proper control immediately, or you will be removed from this class permanently. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Jex replied, but his tone suggested he considered the correction unfair. "Miss Chen," Commander Vrex called out, "please join us." Sarah approached the group, already suspecting what the commander intended. Kale followed, along with several other students who sensed that something significant was about to occur. "Morthane will demonstrate proper control by practicing with Miss Chen," Commander Vrex announced, "since she has already established her ability to handle aggressive behavior appropriately." Jex's eyes widened slightly as he realized what was being proposed. The morning's confrontation had not gone as he had planned, and the prospect of facing Sarah in even a training exercise clearly concerned him. "Sir, is that wise?" Jex asked, "given this morning's incident?" "This morning's incident demonstrated that Miss Chen possesses excellent judgment and control," Commander Vrex replied coldly. "Qualities that you would benefit from observing closely." Sarah accepted the practice weapon that Zell handed her, testing its weight and balance automatically. The training blades were designed to simulate real weapons while preventing serious injury, but they could still cause pain and minor damage if used improperly. "Standard defensive exercise," Commander Vrex announced. "Morthane, you will attack according to the prescribed patterns. Miss Chen will demonstrate appropriate defensive responses. Both students will maintain control at all times." The two students moved to the center of the practice area, with their classmates forming a loose circle around them. Sarah could sense the anticipation in the air as students positioned themselves for the best view of what promised to be an interesting demonstration. Jex raised his weapon to the ready position, his stance correct but tense. Sarah held her blade casually, almost carelessly, but her feet were positioned for optimal movement in any direction. "Begin," Commander Vrex commanded. Jex launched into the first attack pattern with textbook precision, his blade following the prescribed arc that every student in the class had practiced dozens of times. Sarah's response was equally textbook, deflecting the attack and moving smoothly into a counter position that would have created an opening for riposte in actual combat. The exercise continued through the standard sequence, with both students demonstrating proper technique and control. But as the patterns progressed, subtle changes began to appear in Jex's execution. His attacks became slightly faster, his movements more aggressive, his blade striking Sarah's defensive positions with increasing force. Sarah adapted seamlessly to these changes, her defenses becoming more dynamic as needed while maintaining perfect control. When Jex's attacks grew stronger, her blocks redirected the energy rather than absorbing it. When he increased his speed, she moved earlier, making his strikes miss by smaller and smaller margins. "Excellent control from both students," Commander Vrex observed, but his tone suggested he was aware of the escalation that was occurring. The turning point came when Jex, frustrated by his inability to break through Sarah's defenses, abandoned the prescribed pattern entirely and launched a direct attack at her head. The move was fast, aggressive, and completely outside the parameters of the training exercise. Sarah's response was instantaneous. Instead of blocking the attack, she moved inside Jex's reach, her practice blade tracing a path that ended with its tip resting gently against his throat. Her movement was so fast and fluid that most observers missed the transition. One moment Jex was attacking, the next he was frozen with a weapon at his neck and Sarah standing so close that any movement on his part would have been impossible. "Stop," Commander Vreck said quietly. Both students lowered their weapons, but the tableau remained burned in the memory of everyone present. Jex's face showed shock and something that might have been fear, while Sarah's expression remained as calm as it had been throughout the morning's classes. "Miss Chen," Commander Vreck said, "explain what happened." "Jex abandoned the exercise parameters and launched an actual attack," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "I responded appropriately to neutralize the threat while maintaining safety protocols." "And how did you determine that lethal force was not necessary?" "Same way I determined this morning that the threat wasn't real. I assessed the actual situation rather than reacting to assumptions." Commander Vrex nodded slowly. "Class dismissed. Morthane, remain behind for additional instruction." As students began filing out of the gymnasium, the conversations were subdued but intense. Sarah gathered her equipment and headed toward the door, hoping to escape before the inevitable questions began. But Kale intercepted her near the exit. "Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time. "That was incredible. Where did you really learn to fight like that?" Sarah paused, considering how much to reveal. "My father was more than just a soldier. Kyle, and Earth is more dangerous than most people understand." "Could you teach me? Some of those moves, I mean?" The request surprised her. "Why would you want to learn human fighting techniques? You're planning to be a diplomat, not a warrior." "Because," Kyle said seriously, "after today, I'm starting to think that understanding how to defend yourself might be more important than I realized. And because I think there's a lot more to humans than the stories suggest." Sarah studied his face, recognizing genuine interest rather than casual curiosity. "Combat training is serious business, Kale. It's not something you can learn casually." "I understand that. I'm not asking casually." After a moment's consideration, Sarah nodded. "Talk to me after your last class tomorrow. If you're serious about this, we'll discuss it properly." As she walked away, Sarah reflected on the day's events. 2 confrontations with Jex, a public demonstration of capabilities she had hoped to keep private, and now a request for training from a student she barely knew. Her careful plan to remain unnoticed during her time at the academy was clearly no longer viable. But perhaps, she thought as she made her way to her final class of the day, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The other students were finally beginning to see past the myths and stories to recognize her as an individual rather than a representative of her species' reputation. And if that meant dealing with occasional challenges from students like Jex, it might be a price worth paying for the chance to build genuine understanding between humans and the rest of the galaxy. The afternoon's final class was Galactic History, taught in one of the Academy's smaller seminar rooms. Professor Yilan, an elderly Alteran whose 4 arms moved with the careful grace of age, specialized in the study of how different species had made contact and learned to coexist. It was one of Sarah's favorite subjects, both for its intellectual content and for its relevance to humanity's current situation. The day's topic was first contact protocols and how they had evolved over centuries of interspecies encounters. Professor Yilan described the careful procedures that had been developed to minimize misunderstandings when species met for the first time, emphasizing the importance of patience and cultural sensitivity. Sarah took careful notes. struck by how different the reality of first contact was from the dramatic stories that populated human entertainment media. The galaxy had learned through painful experience that assumptions and hasty judgments could lead to conflicts that lasted for generations. As the lesson progressed, she found herself wondering what her own people's first contact experiences would be like when they occurred on a larger scale. Humans were still relatively new to the galactic community, with only a few dozen individuals scattered across various worlds and institutions. The stories and myths that preceded them would inevitably influence how other species perceived them. Perhaps, Sarah thought as Professor Yilan described a particularly delicate first contact scenario, her experience at the academy was itself a kind of first contact in miniature. Every interaction she had with her classmates was helping to shape how they understood humanity, just as their reactions were teaching her about the broader galactic community. When the class ended, Sarah gathered her materials and headed back to her dormitory. The academy's residential wing was quieter than usual, with many students apparently gathered in common areas to discuss the day's events. As she walked through the corridors, she caught fragments of conversation about the incidents in mathematics class and combat theory. Her room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the academy's carefully maintained gardens. She had decorated it simply, with a few books and personal items from Earth. A photograph of her family sat on the desk beside her study materials, reminding her daily of why she was here and what she hoped to accomplish. As she settled down to complete her homework assignments, Sarah reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 6 months was now thoroughly shattered, replaced by a level of attention that she found both uncomfortable and potentially useful. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she was certain. Jex's humiliation in combat class would likely motivate him to find other ways to assert his superiority. Other students would approach her with questions, requests, or challenges of their own. And through it all, she would need to continue representing her species with the dignity and intelligence that would serve humanity's long-term interests. But tonight, she had mathematics problems to solve and history texts to read. Whatever tomorrow might bring, her education would continue, and with it her preparation for the larger role she hoped to play in helping humans find their place among the stars. 3 weeks had passed since the knife incident, and Sarah's life at Centauri Prime Academy had transformed in ways she never could have anticipated. The careful balance of anonymity and observation that had defined her first 6 months was gone, replaced by a complex web of relationships and responsibilities that grew more intricate with each passing day. The most significant change was the group of students who had begun gathering around her during study sessions. What had started with Kale's request for training had evolved into something resembling an unofficial combat instruction program. Word had spread quietly through certain circles that the human girl could teach defensive techniques that were both practical and effective. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being both student and teacher. 3 evenings a week, she met with a small group in one of the academy's unused training rooms to share the survival skills her father had taught her. The sessions attracted an eclectic mix of students: Kale and his diplomatic ambitions, Zell the Vorthon, who had been Jex's unfortunate partner, 2 Centauri sisters named Mira and Lena, who were studying interstellar commerce, and even a quiet Alteran named Theros, whose 4-armed physiology required creative adaptations of human techniques. Tonight's session was focused on situational awareness, a skill that Sarah had learned was severely underdeveloped among species who had evolved on safer worlds. The Academy's students were intellectually sophisticated but often oblivious to their physical surroundings in ways that would have been deadly on Earth. "Close your eyes and tell me what you heard in the last 30 seconds, Sarah instructed as the group sat in a circle on the training room floor. The responses varied wildly. Kyle mentioned the ventilation system and distant conversations from the corridor. Mira had noticed footsteps and the soft hum of the gravity generators. Theros, with his species-enhanced auditory capabilities, provided a detailed inventory of sounds that included things the others hadn't even registered. "Now tell me what those sounds mean," Sarah continued. "Not just what they were, but what information they provided about your environment." This proved more challenging. The students had learned to identify sounds, but not to analyze them for tactical significance. The footsteps that Mira had noticed, for example, belonged to a security patrol following its regular route. The conversations from the corridor indicated the locations and approximate numbers of people nearby. Even the ventilation system's rhythm could provide information about the building's operational status. On Earth, Sarah explained as they worked through the exercise, this kind of awareness is automatic. When everything in your environment might be dangerous, you learn to process sensory information constantly. Your minds are capable of the same analysis, but you've never needed to develop the habit. Zell raised his hand tentatively. "Is it true that humans never fully sleep? Some of the stories say you maintain partial consciousness even when resting." Sarah smiled at the question, recognizing another example of how stories grew in the telling. "We sleep just like everyone else. But many humans do learn to sleep lightly when they're in unfamiliar or potentially dangerous environments. It's a learned behavior, not an innate ability." The session continued with exercises in peripheral vision and threat assessment. Sarah had developed her own teaching methods by trial and error, adapting her father's military training to work with species who had different physical capabilities and psychological frameworks. The results were encouraging. All of the students had shown significant improvement in their awareness and reaction times over the past 3 weeks. As the session concluded, Kale approached her with the serious expression that had become familiar. "Sarah, there's something we need to discuss. About Jex." Sarah had been expecting this conversation. Jex's behavior had become increasingly erratic since his public humiliation in combat class. He no longer made direct confrontations, but his hostility had taken on more subtle and potentially dangerous forms. "What has he done now?" she asked, as the other students gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. "He's been spreading stories," Mira said, joining the conversation, "claiming that humans are a military threat to galactic peace, that your people are planning some kind of invasion and you're here as an advanced scout." Sarah felt a familiar weight settle in her chest. This was exactly the kind of misunderstanding that could set back human integration into galactic society by decades. "How widely have these stories spread?" "It's mostly just his social circle so far," Lena added. "But some of them have influential families. If the wrong people start taking these stories seriously..." The implications were clear. Centauri Prime was a major diplomatic hub, with representatives from dozens of species maintaining embassies and trade missions on the planet. Rumors that reached the wrong ears could result in formal complaints, trade restrictions, or worse. "There's more," Kyle said reluctantly. "He's been asking questions about your background, specifically about your father and why your family came to this system." Sarah's expression hardened slightly. Her family's history was not something she discussed casually, and for good reason. The story of how they had come to leave Earth was complicated and painful, involving circumstances that most galactic citizens would have difficulty understanding. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "Military service records? Family connections? Anything that might support his theory about human infiltration?" "He hasn't found much, but he's been persistent." Sarah nodded slowly, her mind already working through the potential consequences and possible responses. The truth about her father's background would actually support Jex's theories in some ways, while completely undermining them in others. The question was whether revealing that truth would help or hurt the situation. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "I'll handle this." "How?" Theros asked, speaking for the first time that evening. His forearms gestured expressively as he continued. Jex has social connections and family influence that you lack. Direct confrontation would only validate his claims about human aggression. I'm not planning a direct confrontation, Sarah replied. But this situation requires a more comprehensive solution than just ignoring him. The next morning brought an unexpected development that changed Sarah's plans entirely. She was called out of her first-period literature class by a message from the Academy's administrative office. When she arrived, she found Director Keynes waiting for her with an expression of carefully controlled concern. Director Keynes was a distinguished Centauri who had led the Academy for over 2 decades. Her tall frame and silver hair conveyed authority, while her reputation for fairness had earned respect from students and faculty alike. Sarah had met her only once before, during her initial enrollment interview. "Miss Chen, please sit down," Director Keynes said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "We need to discuss a delicate situation that has come to our attention." Sarah took the offered seat, her expression neutral but alert. The office was impressive, with tall windows overlooking the Academy's central courtyard and walls lined with awards and diplomatic gifts from various worlds. "I understand there have been some tensions between you and another student," Director Keynes continued. "Young Morthane specifically. Can you describe these interactions from your perspective?" Sarah provided a careful but complete account of her encounters with Jex, from his initial hostility through the knife incident and its aftermath. She neither minimized his behavior nor exaggerated her own responses, presenting the facts as clearly and objectively as possible. Director Keynes listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a data tablet. When Sarah finished, the director leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. "Your account matches the reports we've received from Professor Thane and Commander Vrex," she said. "Both instructors have spoken highly of your conduct and self-control. However, we've now received a formal complaint from the Kresh Embassy regarding your presence at this academy." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but kept her expression steady. "What kind of complaint?" "They claim that your enrollment here represents a security risk based on your species' alleged military capabilities and aggressive tendencies. They're requesting a full investigation into your background and qualifications." Director Keynes activated a holographic display that showed an official diplomatic communication. The Kresh seal was prominently displayed, lending weight to the formal language that followed. "The complaint specifically mentions incidents involving weapons and combat demonstrations," Director Keynes continued. "It also questions the legitimacy of your scholarship and suggests that your true purpose here may be intelligence gathering." Sarah read through the document carefully, recognizing Jex's influence in every carefully crafted accusation. The complaint was sophisticated enough to raise genuine concerns while avoiding any specific claims that could be easily disproved. "Director," Sarah said when she finished reading, "may I speak frankly about my background and my family's situation?" "Please do. Complete honesty will serve us all better than diplomatic evasions." Sarah took a deep breath, preparing to share information she had kept private since her arrival. "My father was indeed a military officer, as I mentioned in combat class, but he wasn't just any soldier. He was Colonel James Chen of the Earth Defense Force, and he was court-martialed and discharged for refusing to participate in what he considered war crimes." Director Keynes's eyebrows rose slightly, but she gestured for Sarah to continue. "The mission involved a preemptive strike against a human colony world that had declared independence from Earth's central government. My father's unit was ordered to destroy civilian infrastructure to force compliance. When he refused and convinced his subordinates to refuse as well, he was arrested and tried for mutiny." Sarah's voice remained steady as she continued, though the memories were painful. "The court-martial became a public scandal that exposed widespread corruption in the military command structure. My father was eventually exonerated when evidence surfaced that the orders had been issued for personal profit rather than legitimate security concerns. But by then his military career was over and our family had become politically inconvenient. "So you came here," Director Keynes said softly. "We were offered relocation to a neutral system in exchange for my father's silence about other operations he had witnessed. This academy offered me a scholarship based on my academic performance, not my family connections. I came here to learn, not to spy or gather intelligence." Director Keynes made additional notes on her tablet, her expression thoughtful. "This information actually strengthens your position considerably. A family that suffered professionally for opposing military excess is hardly likely to be planning aggressive actions." "The creche won't see it that way," Sarah pointed out. "They'll focus on my father's military background and combat training, not his ethical stands." "Perhaps. But we have options for addressing this situation that don't involve accepting their characterization of events." Director Keynes activated her communication system and spoke briefly with her assistant. Within minutes, the office door opened to admit Commander Vrex, whose presence filled the room with military authority. "Commander," Director Keynes said, "Miss Chen has provided additional context about her family background that I believe you should hear." Sarah repeated her account for Commander Vrex, watching his expression carefully. As a former creche military officer himself, his perspective on her father's actions would be crucial in determining how the Academy responded to the embassy's complaints. When she finished, Commander Vrex was silent for several minutes, his red-skinned features thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "Your father showed true honor," he said simply. "The willingness to sacrifice career and status for ethical principles is rare in any species. The fact that he taught you combat skills for survival rather than aggression is consistent with this character." He turned to Director Keynes. "The embassy's complaint has no merit. Miss Chen represents no threat to Academy security, and her presence here serves the institution's educational mission well." "I agree," Director Keynes said. "But we still need to address the political aspects of this situation. The creche embassy expects a formal response, and young Morthane's family has significant influence." Commander Vrex's expression hardened slightly. "Jex Morthane has brought dishonor to himself and embarrassment to his people through his behavior. Perhaps it's time he learned the consequences of allowing personal prejudice to overcome professional judgment." "What do you suggest?" Director Keynes asked. "A formal demonstration," Commander Vrex replied. "Let the embassy representatives observe Miss Chen in action, both academically and in controlled combat situations. Allow them to evaluate her capabilities and intentions for themselves rather than relying on second-hand reports." Sarah felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation at the suggestion. Public demonstrations carried risks, but they also offered opportunities to address misunderstandings directly. "Would you be willing to participate in such a demonstration?" Director Keynes asked her. "If it would help resolve this situation and prevent problems for other humans in the future, yes," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Very well. I'll contact the embassy and propose an official evaluation session. Commander Vrex, please prepare appropriate test scenarios that will showcase Miss Chen's abilities while addressing the embassy's specific concerns." As the meeting concluded and Sarah prepared to return to her classes, Director Keynes offered one final piece of advice. "Miss Chen, the next few days will be challenging. You'll be representing more than just yourself or even your family. How you conduct yourself could influence how humans are perceived throughout this sector for years to come." "I understand, Director. I won't disappoint you." "I don't believe you will. Your conduct thus far suggests that your father taught you well, both in combat skills and in ethical judgment." Sarah left the administrative office with a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. The careful anonymity of her first 6 months at the academy was definitely over, replaced by a level of scrutiny that would test everything she had learned about diplomacy, combat, and self-control. The news of the upcoming evaluation spread through the academy student network with remarkable speed. By lunchtime, everyone seemed to know that representatives from the Kresh embassy would be visiting to assess the human situation. The reactions varied widely, from excitement among Sarah's training group to nervousness among students who worried about potential diplomatic consequences. Jex's reaction was the most interesting to observe. He had clearly expected his family's influence to result in Sarah's quiet removal from the academy. Instead, he now faced the prospect of having his accusations evaluated in a public forum where the evidence would be clear and objective. Sarah found him waiting for her outside the cafeteria after lunch, his expression a mixture of anger and uncertainty. "This isn't what I wanted," he said without preamble. "What did you want, Jex?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his motivations. "I wanted you gone," he replied honestly. "I wanted the academy to acknowledge that humans don't belong here, that you're too dangerous to mix with civilized species." "And now?" Jex was quiet for a long moment, his red-skinned features troubled. "Now I realize that getting rid of one human won't solve anything. There will be others, and some of them might actually be dangerous." Sarah studied his face, recognizing something she hadn't seen before. "You're afraid of us, not just me, but all humans." "Shouldn't I be?" Jex shot back. "The stories about your people are terrifying. Deathworld survivors who refuse to stay dead, who turn everything into weapons, who fight wars that last for generations. How are we supposed to coexist with beings like that?" For the first time since meeting him, Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy for Jex's position. His hostility had been motivated by fear, and fear was something she could understand and address. "The stories are wrong, Jex, or at least they're incomplete. Yes, humans can be dangerous when we need to be, but we can also be peaceful, creative, and cooperative. The question isn't whether we're dangerous, but whether we choose to use that capability constructively or destructively. How do we know which choice you'll make?" "The same way you evaluate any other species," Sarah replied. "By observing our actions rather than listening to our reputation. By getting to know individuals rather than making assumptions about entire peoples." Jex considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "It's not that simple. My family has investments and interests that could be threatened if humans become major players in this sector. Fear isn't just personal for us, it's economic and political." Sarah nodded, finally understanding the deeper currents that had been driving his behavior. "Then perhaps this evaluation will serve everyone's interests. If humans prove to be responsible members of the galactic community, your family's investments will be more secure, not less." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Kyle and several other members of Sarah's informal training group. They had clearly been looking for her, their expressions showing a mixture of excitement and concern about the upcoming evaluation. "Sarah," Kyle said, "we need to talk about what's going to happen. Some of the faculty are saying this evaluation could affect human admission policies throughout the entire academy system." The weight of responsibility settled more heavily on Sarah's shoulders as she realized the full scope of what was at stake. This was no longer just about her personal situation or even her relationship with Jex. The outcome of the next few days could influence humanity's integration into galactic society for decades to come. That evening's training session took on a different character as Sarah worked with her students to prepare for the evaluation. The exercises focused on demonstrating the practical and defensive nature of human combat techniques, emphasizing control and situational awareness over aggression. "Remember," she told the group as they practiced, "the goal isn't to prove that humans are harmless. It's to prove that we can be trusted to use our capabilities responsibly." The next 2 days passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Commander Vrex worked with Sarah to design demonstration scenarios that would showcase her abilities while addressing the embassy's specific concerns. Professor Thane contributed mathematical problems that would highlight human analytical capabilities. Even Director Keynes participated, helping Sarah prepare for the diplomatic aspects of the evaluation. When the morning of the evaluation finally arrived, Sarah woke early and spent time in meditation, using techniques her father had taught her for managing pre-combat stress. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was using warrior training to prepare for what was essentially a diplomatic mission. The evaluation was scheduled for the Academy's main auditorium, a grand space that could accommodate several hundred observers. Representatives from multiple embassies had requested permission to attend, turning what should have been a routine assessment into something resembling a diplomatic conference. Sarah arrived at the auditorium early, wearing her dress uniform for the first time since her enrollment interview. The simple blue and silver outfit marked her as a scholarship student, but it also carried the dignity of her achievement in earning her place at the Academy. The Kresh delegation was impressive, led by Ambassador Corex himself, rather than a lower-ranking official. His presence indicated that the embassy was taking this evaluation very seriously indeed. Beside him sat two military attachés and a cultural specialist, all wearing the formal robes that indicated they were acting in official capacities. Other embassy representatives occupied reserved sections of the auditorium, their presence transforming the academic exercise into something with genuine diplomatic weight. Sarah recognized uniforms and insignia from a dozen different worlds, all here to observe how the human question would be resolved. Director Keynes opened the proceedings with a formal statement about the Academy's commitment to interspecies education and cooperation. She outlined the evaluation process and emphasized that the goal was understanding rather than judgment. Commander Vrex then took the stage to describe the first demonstration. Sarah would be presented with a series of tactical scenarios designed to test her threat assessment and response capabilities. Each scenario would be observed by the embassy representatives, who would have opportunities to ask questions and request clarifications. The first scenario involved a simulated diplomatic meeting where hidden threats had to be identified and neutralized without disrupting the proceedings. Sarah moved through the exercise with calm precision, identifying concealed weapons, potential escape routes, and security vulnerabilities while maintaining the appearance of casual observation. The Kresh military attachés leaned forward during this demonstration, clearly recognizing the sophistication of the skills being displayed. When the exercise concluded, Ambassador Corex himself stood to ask questions. "Miss Chen, your threat assessment capabilities are clearly advanced. How did you acquire such training?" Sarah's answer was carefully prepared but completely honest. "My father taught me these skills as survival techniques for living in dangerous environments. On Earth, the ability to quickly assess threats and plan responses can mean the difference between life and death." "And you see no military applications for these capabilities?" "I see defensive applications, Ambassador. The skills that keep someone alive in a hostile environment are often the same ones that allow them to protect others in dangerous situations." The questions continued for several minutes, with other embassy representatives joining the discussion. Sarah answered each inquiry directly and honestly, neither minimizing her capabilities nor exaggerating their peaceful intentions. The second demonstration focused on Sarah's mathematical and analytical abilities, using complex problems that required creative thinking and interdisciplinary knowledge. Professor Thane served as moderator, presenting challenges that showcased human cognitive flexibility and problem-solving approaches. This portion of the evaluation went smoothly, with several embassy representatives expressing genuine admiration for the elegance of Sarah's solutions. Mathematics, it seemed, was a universal language that transcended species boundaries and political concerns. The final demonstration was the most challenging, involving controlled combat scenarios where Sarah would face multiple opponents using different fighting styles and weapons. Commander Vrex had designed the exercises to highlight defensive techniques and non-lethal resolution methods rather than aggressive capabilities. As Sarah prepared for this final test, she noticed movement in the auditorium's upper galleries. Additional observers had arrived, including what appeared to be journalists and recording equipment from multiple news services. The evaluation had attracted even more attention than anyone had anticipated. The combat demonstration began with simple scenarios and gradually increased in complexity. Sarah faced opponents armed with various weapons, using her training to neutralize threats without causing serious injury to her opponents. Each exchange was carefully controlled, but the speed and precision of her movements drew appreciative murmurs from the military representatives in the audience. The climactic moment came when Commander Vrex himself entered the combat area, armed with multiple weapons and moving with the deadly grace of a professional warrior. The scenario was designed to test Sarah's ability to handle overwhelming force without resorting to lethal responses. What followed was a brief but intense engagement that demonstrated everything Sarah had learned about combat, diplomacy, and self-control. She managed to neutralize Commander Vrex's attacks while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as unnecessarily aggressive or harmful. When the combat ended with Commander Vrex's ceremonial surrender, the auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause. The demonstration had achieved its goal of showcasing human capabilities while emphasizing their responsible application. Ambassador Corex stood for the final questioning period, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. Miss Chen, you have demonstrated remarkable abilities today, but abilities alone do not determine character. How can we be certain that humans will use these capabilities for constructive purposes? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. The same way you evaluate any other species, Ambassador, by observing our choices over time, by working with us on shared goals, and by judging us as individuals rather than as representatives of abstract stereotypes. She paused, looking out over the assembled diplomats and officials. My father taught me that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to know when force is necessary and when it is not. I believe this principle guides most humans, just as it guides most members of other species. And if we allow greater human participation in galactic society, what assurance do we have that this principle will continue to guide your people? None, Sarah replied honestly. Just as you have no absolute assurance about any other species. But isolation and fear serve no one's interests. Understanding and cooperation, built through careful interaction and mutual respect, offer the best path forward for all of us. The evaluation concluded with statements from various embassy representatives. Most expressed satisfaction with what they had observed, though several called for continued monitoring of human activities in the sector. Ambassador Corex delivered the final statement on behalf of the Kresh Embassy. While we maintain concerns about the long-term implications of human expansion, we acknowledge that Miss Chen has demonstrated both capability and judgment today. We withdraw our objections to her continued enrollment at this academy. As the formal proceedings ended and diplomats began filing out of the auditorium, Sarah found herself surrounded by academy students and faculty offering congratulations. The immediate crisis had passed, but she knew that this was just the beginning of a longer process of building trust and understanding between humans and their galactic neighbors. Jex approached her as the crowd began to thin, his expression complex and difficult to read. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. My fears and prejudices nearly caused a diplomatic incident that could have hurt everyone. Apology accepted, Sarah replied. But understanding is more important than apologies. What matters now is what we do with what we've learned. As Sarah finally left the auditorium and returned to her dormitory, she reflected on the day's events and their larger significance. The evaluation had succeeded in its immediate goal of resolving the crisis, but it had also established precedents and expectations that would influence human integration into galactic society for years to come. Her time at Centauri Prime Academy was far from over, but it had taken on new meaning and importance. She was no longer just a student seeking education, but a bridge between worlds, helping to build the understanding that would allow humans to find their proper place among the stars. That night, as Sarah sat at her desk completing homework assignments that seemed almost mundane after the day's drama, she thought about her father and the principles he had taught her. His willingness to sacrifice his career for ethical principles had set an example that now guided her own choices. The path ahead would not be easy. There would be other challenges, other tests, and other opportunities to prove that humans could be trusted with the responsibilities that came with galactic citizenship. But today had shown that understanding was possible, that fear could be overcome through honest demonstration and patient explanation. Sarah Chen, the girl from the Deathworld, had begun her real education in the most important subject of all, how different peoples could learn to live together in peace.